The leopard just sat there, froze, didn't move a muscle, looking at us. Then suddenly it dropped down on all fours on its belly and it crept along the ditch and out of sight. And everyone just looked at each other in disbelief, thinking, wow, was that real what we just saw?
You say, well, I've seen this big cat, and some people just flatly refuse. They think that Britain's such a sweet little island, we shouldn't have predators that size.
I heard this growl behind me, nothing like a dog's growl, and just like anything else in life, you're sat on your own there. I don't care who you are, how brave you are, something like that will put the shivers up your spine.
As she was walking before the cub came out, she flicked this tail. She literally flicked it in the air. And I simply could not believe what I was seeing. It was the most extraordinary feeling.
It threw its head back, he said, and it made this sort of round.
But when you actually realise that there are big cats living in Britain, it changes everything.
Welcome to Big Cat Conversations. We speak directly to people who've encountered one of Britain's big cats. We also discuss the bigger picture. Why are unofficial big cats being seen, and could these cats even be naturalising without us knowing? If you've had a big cat encounter in Britain and would like to discuss it, email me at rick@bigcatconversations.com. You can find other episodes on the website bigcatconversations.com. I'm Rick Minter, and thanks for joining me. Hello everyone, welcome to episode 14 of Big Cat Conversations. Our guest in a minute is from Cumbria, and I hope you'll find it interesting to have a sculptor's perspective on this subject. He's had 2 different sightings to reflect on, and it influences his work as a sculptor now. So more on that in a moment, and first some brief announcements. If you're listening on schedule, I trust you're having a splendid festive break and looking forward to the new year. And I hope that the endless soggy autumn and winter we're experiencing here in Britain isn't getting you too down. It certainly seems to be influencing big cat reports. We've had far less than usual for this time of year. Normally there's a spike between, say, November and February, but that isn't happening this year. Maybe it's just this lousy wet weather that the jet stream is dolloping on us. And before we get started, a quick preview of the coming year with just a few snippets of what's in store. Later in the year, we've got episodes planned from Suffolk, from Pembrokeshire, and even from Epping Forest on the north edge of London. We also hope to get back to Cumbria again before too long, because there's a lot going on there. And we've got another episode planned on northeast England, and that's with an ex-police officer whose work included taking big cat reports, so we'll get his thoughts and reflections on it all. We'll also be hearing from some farmers in different parts of Britain, and it's always going to be important to get the views from farmers and landowners within these podcast episodes. And I can see from the reviews on iTunes that we've been asked to do an episode on East Sussex, so we're looking into that, I promise, and we'll hopefully get to East and West Sussex during 2020. I've heard of reports in and around Ashdown Forest, for example, and that's where Winnie the Pooh was written, of course, with that heathland environment which would suit big cats. Anyway, we're on the case for East Sussex, and there'll be lots more besides, and we hope to start with our podcast pub evenings in 2020. Any suggestions for pubs that could host us would be welcome. So keep the ideas coming. Email me at rick@bigcatconversations.com. Okay, that's enough background stuff for now. Let's get down to it for this episode. Our guest is from Cumbria, and he is Shawn Williamson. He's a well-known sculptor in that part of the world, and we're going to, in fact, be talking about some of his work because he has done some big cat sculptures, including a panther sculpture, which we'll hear all about within the interview. And Shawn, thank you very much for coming on Big Cat Conversations. Welcome, and we look forward to hearing what you've got to say. I gather your sighting was a few years ago, 2012, was it, in the Thylacine area?
Yes, it was on the backside of Thylacine when that road was open, and I often travelled that road back home, basically, which was from Troutbeck to Cockermouth, where I was living at the time. I'd actually stopped because there was a explosion of feathers, and a peregrine falcon had actually nailed some kind of a pigeon, and the pigeon had gone right in front of the car, and the peregrine, still holding the bird, had stopped in the middle of the road, basically clutching this pigeon whilst I was ground to a halt in the car. And then it just zoomed off as soon as it made eye contact with me. And curiously, it seemed to be an evening of lots of different animal things happening, including an Indian file of deer, which stopped, which I'd seen once I got out of the car, actually to pick the dead pigeon up to put it on the wall. And I thought, what's going on here? And they made eye contact with me. And then something spooked them, not me, incidentally. It was almost as if they'd got the scent of something. It was just, without being too melodramatic, it was just seemed to be all the right ingredients for one of those things to have happened, one of those events to have happened. And basically what I saw was a flash of eyes. I mean, I would have immediately said this was a panther. It contrasted against the brown ferns at the time. And this thing was moving quite rapidly through the undergrowth and really spooked the deers, obviously. That the lead deer in front basically bolted, and this, to all intents and purposes, a panther. I can't think of it, what else it could have been, you know. It was a fair size. Was in and out of the ferns themselves, and that was it. You know, I mean, it wasn't like it stood there and I got a great, magnificent view of it, but I did see it emerging in and out of the ferns. The deer had gone, and that was it. And kind of a flash of eyes when there was kind of a light from the moon, or not the moon, but the remnants of the sun, I guess, seemed to intensify its stare. I saw its tail, and there was a bit of a commotion, and then it was gone. And that was how it happened.
What do you reckon it was doing? Was it there trying to stalk and ambush them, do you think? And you saw them because they sensed it? Or was it coincidence, or are you not sure?
I think it was there because it's a quiet area where there's deer trails or tracks. I think it was there purposely. The only thing that occurred outside of the normal realm of events on that evening was this peregrine falcon nailing the pigeon. Had that not have happened, I'd have probably just carried on driving. It was just all these things happening at once, and it was the reaction of the deer. I mean, I'm quite often in the north of Scotland, and, you know, I'm not an animal wildlife expert or anything, but there was something peculiar going on, and it definitely could not have been a black Alsatian or something like that. It was definitely something moving a lot more subtly than that. So for me, seeing the reaction of the deer, putting two and two together and seeing what I considered to be a big cat, then to me it made perfect sense. It was a very, very isolated area, but perfect for deer.
So this was a predator on business, and the deer recognised that as well?
Yes. I don't see it such a vast abnormality. I mean, my father, who was a sea captain, but not at the time, who lived in Morecambe with my mother, was backwards and forwards pre-Rabies Act. And I know because he brought animals back to the house and left them with my mother and then went back to sea. It was always left to my mother to rehome them. And
yes,
you know, we had very immature baboon, we had ocelots. Ocelots were a big thing that he brought back.
Yeah.
When he was in from South America and stuff. And this was common.
Yes.
I mean, and then people just used to let them go.
Yes, or sell them. They were brought back as currency sometimes to earn a bit of extra.
Yes. I remember in Toronto seeing a guy with Canada when I was at college over there, a guy with a panther on a leash. It was elderly, overweight panther, and he had it on a leash. People had these felines as pets, as status symbols.
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
Not just in Britain.
Absolutely, all over. And Rabies Act came in, made it all illegal. There was a few cases of people succumbing to rabies, I think. And suddenly it was not the thing to have in your house.
Sure. The view you got, could you mention the scale and the length of the tail and anything else, any other characteristics that stood out?
Obviously, the length of tail. And, it wasn't just what you would have expected to be, the quiet cat stalking through the undergrowth. This was making a bit of a rumpus, and it was using its strength, I think, to pull itself through the undergrowth, which had probably been waiting for those deer. And quite often people find carcasses of sheep or roe deer, or this seemed like it had set up its prey scenario,
Yeah, ready for an ambush if it could. What scale compared to a German Shepherd or a Labrador dog would you say this was?
It's hard to judge, but its gait, the way it was moving, was different from a German Shepherd because it was kind of hunkered low with its head being carried low. Every so often I'd get like a glimpse of the head and I could see the tail, and then I'd see something else and then it would disappear. And then just like when you see a roe deer evaporate into nothing, this did the same thing. It just disappeared into the undergrowth. And that's what it does. And actually the same with the deer. They bolted. I'm looking to see if they're going to towards the top of the hill or something like that, but they're just gone.
Yeah. In terms of body mass, would it have been similar to a German Shepherd-sized dog?
Well, it was bigger. It was lower, but more substantial.
Yeah, fair enough. What was the colour? Black, jet black, dark, or what?
It wasn't what you would have expected, like the jet black panther kind of a deal. It was almost like, it seemed to be like a slate grey or something.
Gosh.
Like somehow it had adapted, its camouflage system to suit another environment or something. It also seemed to have more fur,
Yeah. Oh.
More hair.
Interesting. What time of year was it? Was it cold winter time? Because, it's possible that some could develop a sort of winter coat.
I think it was late autumn. It was around that time.
I've got to avoid what we would call confirmation bias and jump to the known main candidate species from what you're saying, but have you considered whether it could have been a cougar, a mountain lion, Puma concolor, rather than a black leopard, black panther type animal? So you can get very grey. There's normally a fair bit of brown in them, but they've got a grey tinge to them, the pumas, the mountain lions.
It could have been, but especially in terms of size, but I do, because I've studied the feline shape through my interest via sculpture.
Yeah.
It definitely seemed to be more panther-like, and I would have been able to have picked out the colour, I think, more so had it been a cougar than trying to pick up a contrast between the browner ferns and whatever it was that was moving through them, you know. Either whether it would be a panther, jaguar style animal or something else, but I can't think of whatever else it could have been,
Yes, very interesting. That's it's rare to have that kind of colour. So yours was a deep slate grey.
Yeah, not what I would have thought as the black panther with, midnight moon qualities and all the rest of it. It was definitely not completely that. It was dark, but I would say we're talking dark grey somehow.
Very interesting. Yeah. And Shawn, you've had another encounter. Could you briefly tell us about that?
That was actually up near Workington, and I can't say that was a panther. That was some other type. I got it down as a puma in my own mind,
Yeah.
Bearing in mind its colour, and it seemed to have it was like an oversized cat with the kind of pointy ears, like the lynx type ears.
Mm-hmm.
Somehow, not that I could identify it completely as that. It was just a lot bigger than a standard cat. It was well made and actually sculptural to look at. That's the thing that I'm interested in when I see felines, is the dynamic muscular frame and how they've adapted as a predator,
Yes. So this one was a sandy grey colour, was it?
Yes, it was. Yeah, it was a sandy grey colour seemed to get a flash of white every now and again, and that just disappeared. And quite often, it's not just about the sighting actually either. It's about having a sense of being watched by something, because I think these escapees or whatever's happened to them, I think they're ultra canny in being able to outwit humans.
Yeah.
And if you can understand that they know humans or have known them in some type of environment, then it's like know the enemy. And
yes. Yeah.
when they're out and stuff, I think that they've got, 6-7 sense to keep away from the dangers of us,
Yes. Which they do in their
yeah.
native countries as well, of course.
Yeah, in their native environments, they develop all these skills in survival aspect to their existence.
So that puma-like one that you saw near Workington, what was it doing? What was the behaviour and what were the circumstances?
It was by the river. Again, it was in the undergrowth, and it was similar to the panther, but moving in a different way. It was actually moving uphill. And you say puma, thinking back on it, it could easily have been a lynx, but it actually seemed to be more like a cross between a puma and a lynx. I didn't see the tail, which would be a good way to identify it, I think, more thoroughly. Although I'm not trying to be an expert on this in any way, shape or form. I'm just interested. I tend to sometimes be in isolated situations. I also have a kind of a sense for picking up disturbances or that feeling that perhaps there's something there or you're being watched. And, I don't think I'm alone with that.
Yeah, and of course it may or may not have had a tail. It may have had a tail, but you didn't see it, or it may not have had much of a tail, and therefore it was a lynx, because they don't have much of a tail to see anyway.
No, they don't. And they've got a different hunting style, so they have developed differently to a puma, for instance.
Yeah, they're not so low sprung, they're not so coiled, and they're more gracile, a bit more upright often.
Yeah, absolutely, and they've got quite long limbs actually. I believe that, some famous boxers, Muhammad Ali used to imitate the striking technique of a lynx.
Really?
Yes, he used to copy animal anatomical movement,
Wow. Okay, I must look that up. The scale of that second one, what would you say, again, relating to a dog, what kind of scale was it?
It was kind of Labrador, but different, more angular. Labradors are a bit rotund and stuff, but it was similar to that, yeah. That particular area that I'm talking about, near Workington and between Cockermouth and Workington, actually, a place called Camerton.
Okay.
It's been notorious for sightings of different, particularly felines,
Yeah. Could we get onto your sculptures? And heavy stone sculptures is your speciality, isn't it, Shawn? And what?
Yeah, I do. I did the big 9-ton Herdwick ram at Cockermouth, which was community training program actually, and I became interested in this idea of the mystique of the Cumbrian panther. I've done loads of commissions over I think 30 public commissions in total, major commissions in this country, mainly in stone. And I do smaller works, particularly animals, animal heads, that type of thing. And I was interested in the mystique of the Cumbrian panther because I also thought it would make a good book as well. In the same way, the book that I wrote, Mauler, on the Tasmanian wolf, which had escaped from a menagerie it was the late 1800s. But I carved the first panther head based on the Thylacine sighting. And then I did another couple of panther heads in Cumbria, Salterwath limestone, which is very hard. I used ancient techniques to carve the stone. So it was crushing it basically with meat tenderizing style tungsten carbide tip hammers to get the shape.
Gosh.
And of course I was interested in the jaguar cult in South America. I spent 6 months some time ago in Chile, and I was in Peru. So, all these things feed inspiration.
How long does it take to do a panther's head in that material?
The panther's heads that I've done to date, they're all obviously life size. And I think the first one was one of the best, actually. I can do a complete head in about 2 to 3 weeks, and that's polished,
Yes.
And the Cumbrian Salterwath limestone, of course, is very similar to, it's kind of a dark brown rather than a black. It's a great colour to work with for the panther.
Yes. We'll put some photos of some of those pieces of work, with your permission, on the website so people can click on this episode and see them on the website, if that's okay. I think you have got photos of them all, haven't you?
Yeah, please do. Yeah,
Yeah.
Of course. Anything we can do to help.
Yeah. What kind of reaction do they prompt from people, the cat and panther heads?
Well, I'd like to think that it was something that made people think, but it's kind of outside the normal realms of existence. And I lived up at the north of Scotland in a lighthouse accommodation for 6 months over one winter.
Mm-hmm.
And the old guy that was there before me, he was out with his gun looking for a big cat that had been attacking not his sheep, but his friend's sheep next to the lighthouse accommodation. It was actually up Wick, in actual fact.
Right, okay.
I talked to a lot of interesting people, but mainly people that have got their feet on the ground and stuff. And these things are occurring around us all the time. But because we live in a kind of a boxed existence to some extent, the mystique eludes us to some extent. And I'd like to think that I'm a person that's picking up some of these other things that are occurring, you know.
Yeah. In terms of working in that material, that sort of heavy stone, do you have to make compromises to get the form of the feline, or do you think it works well for the muscularity of them?
No, it works well. The polished effect, refining, I mean, there's no greater sculpture than the real thing. If you look at the shape of a panther head, you realise how magnificent it is with the muscular strength of its jaws, the way its head is dynamically positioned, the power of the shorter muzzle and the penetrating gaze, the way the ears are held.
Yes.
All these things that you notice. And I think probably most people have seen that YouTube now of, I think it's a black leopard or a jaguar, I can't remember. It's like a leopard, but it seems to be more enhanced. And it actually captures and kills an alligator that's, another half as big as itself.
Yes, the jaguars do that in South America. Yeah, caiman.
Yeah, and it pulled it.
Yeah, caiman. That is
pulled it out of the river.
Yeah,
but they reckon a leopard, pound for pound, is a lot stronger than a lion, for instance.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. What about if you have to do a full body? For example, I saw recently you did a lion. So if you're doing the full body of an animal, how do you do its tail in the sculpture form? Do you have to sort of tuck it in rather than have it isolated and vulnerable?
Yeah, well, I did a few ornamental large-scale lions. They were not really what I would call sculpture, more carving, like for the fronts of people, baronial mansions and stuff like that. But
yeah, so very stylized.
You couldn't have an outstretched tail or something like that. You would wrap the tail around the animal or around its feet because it would be vulnerable in stone, as the ancient masters did,
Yes.
One of the best examples of a feline that was adapted for heraldic courses was done by the Italian sculptor Donatello, and that's been the yardstick for that type of work ever since, and Donatello was a magnificent sculptor. Michelangelo, Cellini, those are some of my favourite masters in actual fact.
Yeah. You can't do a cat's whiskers, really. I suppose you could do the effect. Could you do a kind of muzzly effect in that area to just have to say that's a compromise you have to just drop?
You could do that. I'm sure there's a contemporary way to do that. But, there are kind of pinprick holes, a bit bigger than that actually, where the whiskers protrude from. So that's a further indication. Also, say, for instance, if you wanted to do eyelashes on a human portraiture, you would very, very gently nick the eyelids itself to give it the impression. So it's about giving impression to form or material. And there's ways to do it that would convey the illusion,
Yeah, interesting. Okay, could we get on to this book? So you've done a story based on a real-life event of a thylacine in Cumbria. In fact, we spoke about the thylacine very briefly in the Australian edition with Simon Townsend a few episodes ago, and I didn't think we'd be coming back to mention the thylacine again. But so tell me about this.
The book Mauler I wrote in 2005, and again that was picked up. It was called The Legend of the Girt Dog, and it's based off actual events. There's newspaper articles, whatever it was. Some say it was a Mastiff cross greyhound, had slain 400 head of sheep, and it had attacked hunting dogs, and it had also attacked a huntsman at one point in time. And it became legend, this thing, or this event. They eventually nailed it in one of the rivers, I think, up near Eaglesfield, near Cockermouth. But the carcass had been kept for a long time in Keswick Museum, which is an ancient 19th century museum that not many people know about, but it's an incredible museum, and it had gone missing, the carcass itself. So I don't know what happened. Some people had said that it had been stolen. Nobody really knows. But there are actual incidents of thylacine or Tasmanian wolf, which is what I think it was, escaping from menageries, And the killing patterns of this particular animal was exactly the same as a Tasmanian wolf, which is to eat the liver and take as much blood as possible to get as much energy value as quick as possible. And that's what had been happening to the sheep as well. So the animals had been dispatched, it seemed to be quickly, from what I'd read in newspaper articles, the liver taken and almost the blood drained.
Yes, I've heard about the Gert dog. I didn't realise this was the same thing. Yeah, and we'll put a link, so that's available from people can order that on Amazon, can they? And if so, we'll put a link to that on the website for this episode.
Yeah, well, the writing was a kind of a hobby for me. I always wanted to do that first, really. And when I was at sea myself, I used to write for something to do. And it was actually putting flesh on that kind of boyish intent later on in life. And it is on Amazon. And it was also, the full article was featured in Fortean Times and actually the Reader's Digest also. There was a movie made. I was in touch with a couple of people trying to pitch Mauler when I knew that there was some intent to make a film about the hunting of the last Tasmanian wolves, which sickened me, what happened, the extinction in Tasmania of this incredible marsupial was sickening, and trying to come to terms with what the inhumanity of mankind was the reason that I wrote Mauler. It had a very good review from magnificent writer Andrew Sinclair of the Knights Templar writer, and he also directed Under Milk Wood. Andrew died recently, the end of May this year, aged 85, but he gave it a cracking review. And of course, he was in his heyday, was the reviewer for Penguin.
Oh, wow. Well done. Two things then about the thylacine from what you've just said. Firstly, it may not be extinct, of course. That's what some people reckon. In fact, in our Australian edition, Simon Townsend drops a little hint, actually, which is worth listening to, because he gets information from people who track mammals in Australia, so that was interesting. The film you mentioned, I've forgotten its name now, but there is a very interesting, half-decent Australian film about the tracking, hunting of the last thylacine, and I don't want to do a plot spoiler, but it has got a very interesting twist to it. I'll find it, remember what it's called, and put a link to that on the episode for this one on our website as well. Is that the film you're talking about?
It is, yeah, it is. I did see a video of the film, and it was pretty good in actual fact. But, the reason that the Tasmanian wolf is called Mauler is because that's its generic name, because it's between a dog and a wolf. But the crushing power of its teeth or its jaws exceed both the dog and the wolf.
Okay, I didn't know that, yeah. Very lithe body, hasn't it? It's not heavily built like a wolf.
No, it's not as big, but its head's very, very powerful. Its jaws particularly, which can distend almost like a snake. And there's quite a few pictures of it with this distended jaw, and the teeth are enormous. And it was almost like a wolverine in as much as it wasn't as fast as a wolf or a dog, but it was persistent and lolloped apparently, and was relentless in pursuit of its prey.
Yeah, good stamina. Yeah,
very good stamina. And I think that the Brits that had gone over to Australia had taken hunting dogs to try and subdue it, and quite often those dogs came unstuck.
Okay, our words of the week for this episode are general impression of size and shape, or GISS. the traditional form of the word, which started in military terms for gauging what a shape in the distance might be. And of course, general impression of size and shape is commonly used by bird watchers when they're looking at a dot in the sky and wondering whether it's a sea eagle or an eagle or a buzzard or whatever in the distance, and they quickly, as an experienced observer of these creatures, use the GISS to work out what it is before them. That, of course, can relate to mammals such as cats and big cats and distinguishing cats and dogs. And in fact, I'm going to put a clip from the media this past year, from April 2019, of what I think is one of the best bits of footage of a black panther, black leopard type animal, maybe, in the British countryside that's been filmed. It's only a glimpse, it's only a snippet, but I think quickly assessing the GISS of that animal helps you. It needs scaling, of course, like any footage does. It would be very difficult to scale because of the angle and the location and actually getting a match on that precise location. But I think the person who took that footage did very well. He seemed to creep up on it as it was observing deer and managed to get out his mobile phone in time and answer the critics who say, oh, people never get their mobile phones out for these animals. This guy did. If he ever listens to the podcast and would like to come on the show, it would be great to ask him all about that encounter. So I'll put that under episode 14 on the references and links part of the Big Cat Conversations website. That was filmed in the Forest of Dean and it was in the Gloucestershire media in April 2019. So do look out for that. I presume also general impression of size and shape is relevant to sculptors like Shawn, who we're speaking to at the moment, because as he's saying, they often just form an impression of the animal or object they're carving and casting for their sculpture work. So there's our word of the week, general impression of size and shape. We'd better get on to the common question for everybody. And again, it's however you respond is fine for all of us. And it's how you feel about big cats living in the wild in Britain in general.
I think I like the idea, and we can't have it all our own way in this world. We can't domesticate everything. I mean, quite often what I think has been happening is that they've probably got a very strong scent for their own kind. And, there's probably that many incidents of cats being released that there may be small communities of feline predators in existence, but living in remote areas and operating at night. They're not going to be an easy thing to catch, I think, even with packs of dogs or whatever. But I like the mystique of it, and there's something anti-civilization about it that I'm enthralled by,
But okay, what about the situation where you knew this guy who was bothered by some sheep kills? How do you feel if that happens?
It's not for me to advise. The farming community can deal with those problems themselves, I think, and they're not necessarily going to solve them. But if I had a flock of sheep and they were being taken by something that I wasn't quite certain about, they'll know that it's not a fox, There's been quite a few farmers, not just here, some in Scotland as well, that I've known that have come across anomalous deaths of flock of sheep and not dogs, They've been, the carcasses have been treated or dealt with in another way by whatever predators got them, and taken to places as well. The practicalities of living with those occurrences, if you're a farmer, with livestock, obviously you're going to try to arrange to sort the problem out, but they're very elusive, these animals. And I know that the police in the south, Cornwall, I think, other areas where these occurrences have happened, they've not had any success. Nobody seems to have that much success.
I think you're right. I think in terms of pursuing them, it is extremely difficult because they're stealthy, and we don't have trained hounds like they would do for pumas in America, of course. And the circumstances, just the logistics of using hounds to pursue a big cat in the British landscape would be very difficult across roads and fencing and different land tenure.
I think so, yeah. And these predators have developed strategies to suit their environment in which they live. They develop in terms of survivalistic mechanisms,
Yes, yeah, very resourceful, yeah. Yeah, Shawn, this has all been terrific stuff, and thank you for covering, all the key points. Is there anything else that you'd like to say, or things you feel we haven't touched on that you'd like to mention?
I've kind of exhausted my armoury of information, but I am a fan of 14 times, for instance, and I do like to see or exist with a bit of supernatural occurrence around me in nature, and not think that we've got everything so pinned down and in the box that our lives become mundane. So it is an area that I'm obviously fascinated in, but it's backed up, I think, by quite a lot of hard evidence. And that's the thing, obviously I've got this romantic side to my personality, but I'm also listening to people that have got the hard practical reality of seeing what's occurred in nature, and also knowing about a lot of stuff that's been covered up.
Yeah. How would you respond to somebody, maybe a really sort of stubborn skeptic, saying, Mr. Williamson, you've just admitted that you're interested in unorthodox, unusual, beyond normal realm of things, and so you're biased. You've actually invented the creature that you yearn to see, so we can't say that your sightings are objective. How do you respond to that kind of criticism or that kind of observation?
I would say, well, you're an empiricist. You have a linear approach to these matters, and as we know now, with developments in the world, in a multidimensional way, the linear thinkers are being overturned, and that's exactly what I would say to them. I would say, let's have a look at some other ways of working these problems out, because so far it's the believers that are, in my mind, winning, because in actual fact, they also sway the public as well.
Presumably, Shawn, you would also say that you do your utmost to be objective in your observations and analysis.
Well, absolutely. Especially when I'm researching something as well. I mean, I'm reading, formulating opinions based off events and real evidence and testimonies in that way. It's like getting a scientist to examine an anomalous event somewhere. He's going to have a certain approach in dealing with that problem. It's more interesting to work with people that have got a lateral approach to the solution. And somewhere between both approaches, perhaps we've got the truth.
Yeah, sure. We've all got our own baggage, haven't we? But it can help us at times in our own analysis. Do you yearn to see another one, Shawn? A lot of witnesses do, or have you sort of comforted in the fact you've had two, you've communed with the big cat twice?
Yeah, well, the first event was the main thing, but when I was in South America, I did see the indigenous cougar a few times over there in the south of Chile, Chiloé, it's called.
Yeah, where they call them, and they call them puma, don't they? As if it's spelt P-O-O-M-A.
Yes, and there had been occurrences. My girlfriend had seen one knocked over on the road and killed, which upset her greatly. But I saw some in the wilderness, and it wasn't like the Thylacine sighting, but it did make the hairs on the back of my neck rise up,
And you're lucky to see them in the wild there, to be honest. I know they say the numbers are increasing a bit. That was on the BBC Attenborough documentary just about a month ago when they were filming them hunting guanacos. And some of the filmmakers there said, we did this a few years ago and it was hard work to find any at all.
Yeah.
It just shows you they can be very elusive in the creatures to see in their native countries, even if you're going to areas where sightings are known of.
When I was in Santiago, in the mountain ranges above Santiago, condors are quite common there. You find condor feathers, but to people in, say, in this country, it's perhaps an unusual event. It just depends. There's a chance element. It's where you are at the right time. And these things are out there. But, there's no guarantee that you're going to see anything at all.
Of course.
You could actually condition yourself never to see anything, because scientists are taught, you believe the linear thinkers.
Yeah. In fact, there's a book, How to Walk a Puma, and it starts off with this guy actually arriving in one South American country, can't remember where, and he says that he wants to see a puma and in the wild, and they say, seeing a puma in the wild, you've got more chance of getting pregnant from a llama.
Right. Yeah.
So that's how lucky you were, Shawn.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think, if you're open to these things, I had some incredible experiences with particularly hawks, and I can send you the pictures actually, whereby this particular type of opportunist hawk would follow you around and just appear. And then suddenly, this small island I was staying on, a probably completely different pair of the same type of hawk nested. And before I'd finished, I was feeding them ham off a stick. How about that? I think they know.
Habituated them.
Yeah, something like that. But
habituated them, yeah.
They have a sixth sense, I think. And
yes, and they read your vibes and know you're not in a threatening mode or position.
Well, yeah, and I suppose if you read Rupert Sheldrake, the sense of being stared at, his book, all this stuff seems to come together. But like, for instance, a crow can gauge from its aerial vantage point whether a human being is going to be dangerous or not, or if he's carrying something that's dangerous like a shotgun, and it will stay out of range, But if it's a stick or a walking stick or something, it won't. It will come closer.
Yeah, you're reminding me now of a filmmaker who said he was making a documentary on wild boar, and he'd gone to a place in France and he was with two hunters, and this male wild boar got freaked out and turned on them, and three of them were there holding machines in their hand. He had the camera, big contraption, and the others had firearms, and the boar was only interested in attacking those two, realising they were a threat. And he said somehow it could distinguish the machine that I was carrying was not going to do it potentially harm.
Yeah, exactly. And that's a great way of exemplification of the point I just made. We do not completely understand the animal kingdom, but we are beginning to know more about it and stuff. And I mean, the message in Mauler was, let's not make extinct all these magnificent creatures on the earth, because they contribute to our sense of mystique, the sense of what we're about as human beings. And it's not going to be good for mankind to kill everything it possibly can,
Yes, especially needlessly, yeah.
Needlessly. And I know that there's multi-dimensional arguments and stuff like that, but there's no better thing than to have a kind of a relationship to some extent with an animal, in terms of, for instance, a guy that goes out with a hawk or a falcon, working with animals in all the sense that we've managed to adapt them to work with man as well is a great thing.
Yes, takes you to a higher level.
Absolutely, yeah.
Shawn, I'm going to say this, but in case we don't get this guest on the show in the future, but and I don't know if I've mentioned, but there is another witness who is a sculptor, and his sighting was in Shropshire a few years ago, and his sighting was while he was finishing off his sculpture in a sculpture park setting, so it was outside. He was doing it in situ. It was going to end up where he was creating it. And I think it was late in the day. It was a typical sort of dusk situation where the panther turns up in the twilight. And he said he was able to watch it because he just was there behind his large sculpture. So he just stuck behind it and had a peek over the top of it and watched this panther walk right past him for 20 seconds or so. Had a really good close-up view. So I'm saying that in case we don't get the gentleman on. But
fabulous. Yeah, no, that's... there's many people had the same thing happen. I'm just starting to get a little bit frazzled there with all this information we've pumped out today.
Yeah.
It's been a pleasure talking to you.
Yes, thank you very much for coming on Big Cat Conversations. And we've gone much wider and deeper than I think we intended, but I think it's all been grist to the mill. So really grateful to you, Shawn, for coming on and being one of our guests.
That's really smashing, yes. And keep me posted on all these future developments.
Yeah, sure. And we'll put all those things we mentioned on the website, so the film and your book and pictures of your sculptures. All the best with your future work, Shawn.
Yeah, thank you very much, Rick, and keep up the good work.
OK, before we close, there are 3 points to make in order to clarify some issues from our interview with Shawn. First, I did check afterwards that he did mean a peregrine falcon at the outset of his interview rather than a sparrowhawk, and indeed it was a peregrine that he saw taking out the pigeon before his panther sighting. Second, the Australian film that we discussed about the Thylacine. I said I'd look it up. It's called The Hunter, and we put a link under episode 14 on the website, so you can get an idea of the vibes of that film from the trailer through that link. And third, I mentioned a book called How to Walk a Puma in the latter part of the interview, and that book is by Peter Allison. I said that he mentioned he arrived in South America saying he was hoping to see a puma in the wild. But in fact, it was a jaguar. I've checked in the book, it was a jaguar, not a puma, even though he was quickly told he had no chance of seeing a jaguar. But I think that's equally the case for pumas. They would be very elusive and difficult to see as well. Finally, a brief mention of our next episode. Stand by for the panther of southern Spain, which I mentioned a few episodes back that we were going to talk about. So we're going to hear about what happened when a black panther was released on a British guy's land in southern Spain. We'll learn how different the behaviour can be to the seemingly wild and naturalising cats here in Britain. We'll hear all about that in 2 weeks' time. And this is our last episode of 2019. For those of you who listen on schedule, it's time to wish you all a Happy New Year and best of luck everyone for 2020. So thanks very much for listening to Big Cat Conversations. Bye for now and take care.